She walked into the bunkhouse kitchen with frost on her collar and defiance in her eyes, ready to cook for men who'd rather spit on her boots than say grace over her biscuits. But the real danger wasn't the sneers or the cold. It was the one cowboy who wouldn't meet her gaze, the quiet man with work-worn hands and a secret that could cost her everything she'd come to build. Because Luke McCrae wasn't just another ranch hand. He was the owner's son, hiding in plain sight. And years ago, he'd watched her world burn and done nothing to stop it. If you're ready to walk through fire, betrayal, and a love that refuses to stay buried, stay with me until the very end. And when you're done, drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far Tessa's story can ride. The wind off the Bitterroot Range hit like a fist wrapped in ice. Tessa Crowley stepped down from the freight wagon with her carpet bag in one hand and her mother's battered cookbook tucked under her arm like a shield. The driver didn't wait for thanks. He slapped the reins, turned the mules, and left her standing in a yard of frozen mud and trampled snow, alone, except for the sharp eyes watching from the bunkhouse porch. She counted 5 men. Maybe 6, if the shadow leaning against the barn counted as human. None of them moved to help. None of them smiled. Good. She hadn't come for smiles. "I'm here about the cook position," Tessa called, her voice steady despite the cold chewing through the thin wool of her coat. "Name's Tessa Crowley. I can start today." The nearest cowboy, a barrel-chested man with a graying beard and a face like sun-cracked leather, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the snow. "You're a woman." "I noticed that about myself, yes." A ripple of laughter, mean and sharp, rolled through the group. The bearded man didn't laugh. He folded his arms across his chest and looked her over the way a man might size up a horse with bad teeth. "Boss didn't say nothing about hiring a woman." "Boss didn't say he wouldn't either." Tessa shifted the bag to her other hand and met his stare without flinching. "I can make biscuits that'll fill a belly and coffee strong enough to wake the dead. I don't complain, I don't gossip, and I don't need looking after." "That what you're paying for? Or did I ride 6 hours in the cold for nothing?" The bearded man hawked and spat again. "We got standards here." "So do I." Tessa took a step forward, boots crunching in the frozen slush. "And one of them is not standing in a yard freezing while grown men decide if I'm worth the trouble. So here's what's going to happen. I'm going inside that cookhouse, I'm lighting that stove, and I'm making supper. You want to eat? You eat. You don't, you go hungry. Either way, I'm getting paid." She didn't wait for an answer. She turned on her heel and walked straight toward the low-slung building with the crooked chimney, her breath coming out in clouds, her heart hammering so hard she thought they might hear it. Behind her, boots scraped on wood. Someone muttered something she couldn't catch. Someone else laughed, but it sounded less certain this time. The cookhouse door stuck in the frame. Tessa threw her shoulder against it, and it gave with a groan that echoed through the empty room. Inside, the air was colder than outside, stale and thick with the smell of old grease and smoke. A cast-iron stove squatted in the corner like a sullen animal. Shelves lined the walls, half of them bare. A rough-hewn table sat in the center of the room, scarred and stained, surrounded by mismatched chairs that looked like they'd been cobbled together from wagon parts. It was perfect. Tessa set down her bag, laid the cookbook on the table like a promise, and rolled up her sleeves. The stove was filthy. Ash and soot clogged the grate, and the flue stuck when she tried to open it. She worked it loose with the poker, then built a fire from the kindling stacked beside the wood box. The flames caught slow, reluctant, but they caught. She fed them carefully, piece by piece, until the stove began to tick and hum with heat. While the fire built, she took stock of the pantry. It wasn't much. A barrel of flour, half empty, a tin of lard gone hard and yellow, a sack of dried beans that looked older than she was. Salt, a little sugar, no eggs, no butter, no milk. Tessa had worked with less. She hauled out the flour and the lard, found a mixing bowl with a crack down the side, and set to work. Her hands moved without thought, the way they always did when she was cooking, measuring by feel, kneading by instinct, her mother's voice a low hum in the back of her mind. "Good biscuits don't lie, Tessa. You put care in, you get care back." The dough came together under her palms, soft and pliable. She rolled it out on the scarred table, cut rounds with the rim of a tin cup, and laid them on a blackened baking sheet. Into the oven they went, and she turned her attention to the coffee. There was no grinder, so she wrapped the beans in a clean rag and smashed them with the flat of a skillet until they cracked and bled their dark, bitter smell into the cold air. She dumped them into the battered pot, added water from the pump by the door, and set it on the stove to boil. By the time the biscuits were golden and the coffee was strong enough to strip paint, the light outside had started to fade. Tessa wiped her hands on her apron, walked to the door, and rang the iron bell that hung from a post outside. The sound cut through the stillness like a blade. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then boots scuffed on frozen ground, and the men came, slow and skeptical, their faces guarded. They filed into the cookhouse without speaking, took their seats at the table, and stared at the basket of biscuits in the center like it might bite them. The bearded man, Tessa learned later his name was Clem, reached for one first. He tore it open, steam rising from the soft white center, and took a bite. His jaw worked. His eyes narrowed. Then he reached for another. That was all it took. The rest of the men fell on the biscuits like wolves on a carcass, their hands quick and rough, their silence broken only by the sound of chewing and the scrape of tin cups on wood. Tessa poured coffee, refilled the basket twice, and stood by the stove with her arms crossed, watching them eat. Not one of them said thank you, but not one of them left a crumb either. When the meal was done and the men had shuffled back out into the cold, Tessa cleaned the dishes, banked the fire, and sat down at the table with the cracked bowl in her lap and her mother's cookbook open in front of her. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against the worn pages and made herself breathe. She'd done it. She'd walked into a room full of men who didn't want her and made them need her. Now all she had to do was keep it. The door creaked open behind her. Tessa turned, one hand going to the knife she kept tucked in her apron pocket. But it wasn't Clem or one of the others. It was the shadow from the barn, the one who hadn't come to the table. He stood in the doorway, tall and lean, with dark hair that fell across his forehead and eyes that caught the lamplight like river stones. He didn't say anything, just looked at her, long and steady, like he was trying to solve a puzzle he didn't have all the pieces to. "You missed supper," Tessa said, her voice sharper than she meant it to be. "I know. There's biscuits left, coffee too if you want it." "I'm good." He turned to leave. "Wait." Tessa didn't know why she said it, didn't know why it mattered, but something in the way he looked at her, careful, cautious, like she was something fragile that might shatter if he got too close, made her chest tighten. He stopped, but he didn't turn back around. "What's your name?" she asked. A pause, long enough that she thought he might not answer. "Luke." "Well, Luke?" Tessa stood, brushing flour dust from her apron. "Next time you come when the bell rings. I don't keep food warm for stragglers." He glanced over his shoulder just for a second, and she caught the faintest flicker of something in his expression. Surprise, maybe, or something softer. Then it was gone. "Yes, ma'am," he said quietly, and disappeared into the dark. Tessa stood there for a long time after he left, staring at the empty doorway, wondering why a man who hadn't said more than 5 words to her felt like the most dangerous person on this ranch. The days that followed fell into a rhythm as hard and unyielding as the frozen ground. Tessa woke before dawn, lit the stove, and started breakfast while the stars were still sharp in the sky. Cornmeal mush, fried salt pork, biscuits when there was flour, Johnny cakes when there wasn't. The men ate in silence, their faces carved from stone, their eyes fixed on their plates. They didn't thank her. They didn't insult her either. It was a cold truce, and Tessa held her side of it without complaint. But she noticed things. She noticed the way Clem always took the chair closest to the door, like he was ready to bolt at the first sign of trouble. She noticed the way the younger hands, boys really, with peach fuzz on their cheeks and dirt under their nails, snuck extra biscuits into their pockets when they thought she wasn't looking. She noticed the way they all tensed when Boots hit the porch, the way their laughter died the second the door opened. And she noticed Luke. He was always the last to arrive and the first to leave. He didn't sit with the others. He took his plate to the corner by the stove, ate standing up, and left his dishes stacked neatly by the wash basin without a word. He never looked at her directly, but she felt his gaze all the same, steady and heavy like a hand on her shoulder. It unnerved her. Most men, when they looked at Tessa, saw one of 2 things, a woman they could use or a woman they could discard. Luke's eyes held something different, something that felt uncomfortably close to recognition. She told herself it didn't matter. She was here to work, not to unravel the mysteries of silent cowboys with complicated eyes. But every time he walked into the cookhouse, every time he stood in that corner with his shoulders hunched and his hat pulled low, she felt the air shift, and she hated that she noticed. 3 weeks in, she ran out of flour. Tessa stood in the pantry, staring at the empty barrel, her hands balled into fists. She'd stretched it as far as it would go, measuring every cupful with the precision of a jeweler weighing gold. But there were 15 hungry men on this ranch, and no amount of rationing could make one barrel feed them forever. She marched across the yard to the main house, a 2-story structure with peeling paint and a sagging porch that looked like it had been grand once, back when someone cared. She knocked hard enough to rattle the frame. The door opened, and a woman stood there, thin and sharp-eyed, with gray hair pulled back in a tight bun and a mouth that looked like it had forgotten how to smile. "Yes?" "I need to speak to the boss," Tessa said, "about supplies." The woman looked her up and down, her expression souring. "Mr. McCrae doesn't take meetings with the help." "Then I'll wait until he does." "You'll do no such thing. If you need something, you tell me, and I'll pass it along." Tessa's jaw tightened. "I need flour, lard, coffee, sugar if there's money for it, eggs if there's chickens. I can't feed 15 men on dust and hope." The woman's mouth thinned. "We don't have money for luxuries. Flour isn't a luxury, it's food." "I said we don't have money." "Then what do you have?" The silence that followed was cold enough to freeze blood. The woman's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Tessa thought she might slam the door in her face. But then a voice called from somewhere inside the house, deep and irritated. "What's the racket, Mrs. Kern?" The woman stepped back, and a man appeared in the doorway, older, with a gray beard and the kind of shoulders that came from a lifetime of hard work. His eyes were sharp, though, and when they landed on Tessa, they didn't soften. "You're the cook," he said. It wasn't a question. "I am. What's the problem?" "No flour, no lard, no eggs. I'm doing what I can, but I can't make something out of nothing." He grunted. "Town run's not for another 2 weeks. Then the men go hungry." "Men have gone hungry before." "Not on my watch." Tessa stepped forward, her chin up, her voice hard. "You hired me to feed them, and I'll feed them. But I need supplies to do it. If you can't get them, I'll find a way myself." The man studied her for a long, uncomfortable moment. Then, to her surprise, the corner of his mouth twitched. "You got grit, I'll give you that." He turned to Mrs. Kern. "Get her what she needs." Mrs. Kern's face went red. "But Mr. McCrae?" "I said get it." He looked back at Tessa. "Anything else?" She should have said no, should have taken the win and walked away, but something stubborn and reckless flared in her chest, and before she could stop herself, she asked, "Why'd you hire a woman if you didn't think I could do the job?" Mr. McCrae's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, something that might have been respect. "I didn't hire you because I thought you could do it," he said. "I hired you because no one else would take it." He closed the door. Tessa stood there, staring at the peeling paint, her heart pounding in her chest. Then she turned and walked back to the cookhouse, her boots crunching in the snow, her breath coming out in sharp white clouds. No one else would take it. She'd spent her whole life being the woman no one else wanted, the girl from the wrong side of town, the cook in the saloon kitchen, the one men whispered about but never defended. And now here she was again, standing in a frozen yard, fighting for scraps. But this time she wasn't going to lose. 2 days later, a wagon arrived with flour, lard, and a crate of eggs packed in straw. There was sugar, too, a small sack, but enough. Tessa didn't ask where it came from or how much it cost. She just took it, stored it carefully, and got back to work. The men noticed. They didn't say anything, but the next morning, when she set out fresh biscuits with butter and honey, the silence at the table felt different. Warmer, somehow. Less like a wall and more like a waiting room. It was Clem who broke it. "These are good," he said gruffly, not looking at her. Tessa paused, the coffee pot in her hand. "Thank you." "Don't let it go to your head." She almost smiled. Almost. That evening, after the dishes were done and the fire banked, Tessa stepped outside to dump the wash water. The night was clear and cold, the stars so bright they looked like chips of ice scattered across black velvet. She stood there for a moment, breathing in the sharp, clean air, letting the stillness settle into her bones. Then she heard the footsteps. Luke came around the corner of the cookhouse carrying an armload of split wood. He stopped when he saw her, his eyes flicking to the bucket in her hands. "Didn't mean to startle you," he said. "You didn't." Tessa set the bucket down. "What's the wood for?" "Stove's gonna need it. Gets colder at night this time of year." "I know how cold it gets." "I'm sure you do." He moved past her, stacking the wood neatly by the door, his movements careful and deliberate. Tessa watched him, trying to make sense of the knot of irritation and curiosity twisting in her chest. "You don't eat with the others," she said. Luke straightened, brushing bark dust from his gloves. "No, ma'am." "Why not?" "Just prefer it that way." "That's not an answer." His jaw tightened. For a moment she thought he might walk away, but then he turned to face her fully, and in the starlight his eyes looked darker, sadder. "I'm not much for company," he said quietly. "Neither am I, but I still show up." "That's different." "How?" He didn't answer, just looked at her, and this time she didn't look away. The silence stretched between them, thin and fragile, and Tessa felt something shift, something she couldn't name and didn't want to. "Thank you," she said finally. "For the wood." Luke nodded once, then turned and walked back into the dark, his boots crunching softly in the snow. Tessa stood there until the cold seeped through her coat and made her shiver. Then she went inside, locked the door, and sat down at the table with her mother's cookbook open in front of her. But she didn't read. She just stared at the pages, thinking about a man who brought her firewood without being asked, and wondering why that felt more dangerous than anything else on this frozen, unforgiving ranch. The trouble started on a Saturday. Tessa was in the pantry counting supplies when she heard the thunder of hooves in the yard. She looked out the window and saw a rider dismount, tall, broad-shouldered, with a red kerchief tied around his neck and a swagger in his step that made her stomach tighten. She recognized that swagger. Rafe Dillon. He'd been gone when she arrived, off driving cattle to market or some other errand that took him away from the ranch for weeks at a time. She'd heard his name in passing, always spoken with a mix of admiration and caution, the way men talk about someone who's useful but unpredictable. Tessa had hoped he'd stay gone. She went back to counting beans, trying to ignore the way her hands had started to shake. But she could hear him outside, his voice loud and brash, cutting through the cold air like a knife. "Boys, you miss me?" Laughter, the kind that felt forced, obligatory. "Hell, Rafe, we didn't even notice you were gone." That's a damn lie, and you know it." More laughter. "What's for supper? I'm starving." A pause. Then Clem's voice, careful. "New cook made stew. It's good." "New cook?" Rafe's tone sharpened. "What happened to old Gus?" "Gus quit. Rode out back in November." "And you replaced him with who?" Another pause, longer this time. Tessa set down the beans and moved to the window. Through the frost-etched glass, she could see Rafe standing in the center of the yard, his hands on his hips, his head cocked like a dog catching a scent. "Well?" he demanded. "Who'd they hire?" Clem shifted his weight. "Woman named Tessa Crowley." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. Then Rafe laughed, a low, mean sound that made Tessa's skin crawl. "Crowley? Tessa Crowley? You know her?" one of the younger hands asked. "Know her?" Rafe shook his head, still grinning. "Hell, I've seen her. Over in Bannock at the Velvet Spur." Tessa's blood turned to ice. "The Spur?" someone said. "That's a saloon, yeah. And she worked there. In the kitchen, sure. But you know how those places are. Women who work in saloons don't stay in the kitchen long." "Watch your mouth, Rafe." Clem's voice was hard. "She's just the cook." "Is she?" Rafe's grin widened. "Or is she something else they brought in to keep the boys entertained?" Tessa didn't hear the rest. She turned away from the window, her hands pressed flat against the rough wood of the pantry shelf, her breath coming too fast and too shallow. She'd known this was coming, known it the second she saw Rafe's face. Men like him always found out, always dug up the past and threw it in her face like trash. But knowing didn't make it hurt less. She forced herself to move, forced herself to check the stew, stir it, add salt even though it didn't need it. Her hands were steady, her face was calm. She'd learned a long time ago how to hide the shaking on the inside. When the bell rang for supper, the men came as they always did. But this time they didn't sit down. They stood in the doorway, shifting from foot to foot, their eyes anywhere but on her, all except Rafe. He walked in like he owned the place, pulled out a chair, and sat down with his boots propped on the table. "Well, well," he said, looking her up and down with a grin that made her want to scrub her skin raw. "Tessa Crowley, didn't expect to see you here." Tessa set down the ladle. "Didn't expect to see you either." "I bet." He leaned back, his grin widening. "How's life been treating you since the spur? Still cooking for drunks and dodging handsy customers?" "I'm cooking for Cowboys now. Not much difference." The men shifted uncomfortably. Rafe's grin faltered just for a second, then came back sharper. "That's funny, real funny. But the boys ought to know who they're eating with, don't you think? Ought to know where you came from." "I came from the same place everyone comes from," Tessa said evenly. "I came from trying to survive." "That what they're calling it now?" Clem stepped forward. "Rafe, that's enough." "Enough?" Rafe turned to face him, his expression hard. "You're telling me you knew she worked at the Spur and you're fine with it? You know what kind of women work at places like that." "She's the cook," Clem said. "She does her job. That's all that matters." "Does she?" Rafe stood, his chair scraping against the floor. "Or is she just waiting for the right offer?" The room went still. Tessa felt the weight of every eye on her, felt the judgment settling over her shoulders like a cloak made of stone. She'd been here before, stood in rooms like this facing men like Rafe and watched them decide she wasn't worth defending. But this time, something broke. "Get out," she said. Rafe blinked. "What?" "I said get out." Tessa's voice didn't shake, didn't waver. It was cold and hard and sharp enough to draw blood. "You don't like my cooking. You don't eat it. You don't like me. You don't have to look at me. But you don't get to stand in my kitchen and call me a whore." Rafe's face went red. "Your kitchen? That's right, my kitchen. I earned it. And you?" She stepped forward, close enough that he could see the fury in her eyes. "You don't know a damn thing about what I've earned or what I've survived. So take your poison somewhere else, because I'm done swallowing it." For a long, breathless moment, no one moved. Then Rafe laughed, a bitter, ugly sound. "You got guts, I'll give you that. But guts don't change what you are." He turned and walked out, slamming the door behind him. The men stood frozen, their faces pale, their eyes wide. Tessa turned back to the stove, her hands gripping the edge of the cast iron so hard her knuckles went white. "Anyone else hungry?" she asked, her voice steady. "Or are you all done too?" One by one they sat down, and one by one they ate. But the silence that filled the cookhouse wasn't the same as before. It wasn't cold or distant. It was heavy, weighted, like a storm that hadn't broken yet but was already pressing down on their shoulders, making it hard to breathe. Tessa served the stew, poured the coffee, cleared the plates. And when the last man had left and the dishes were washed and the fire banked, she sat down at the table and let herself shake. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried in years. But she shook, and she hated herself for it. The door opened. Tessa's head snapped up, her hand going to the knife. But it wasn't Rafe. It was Luke. He stood in the doorway, his hat in his hands, his face shadowed. "You all right?" "I'm fine." "You don't look fine." "I said I'm fine." Her voice cracked just a little, and she hated that too. Luke stepped inside and closed the door behind him. He didn't come closer, just stood there, his shoulders tense, his eyes dark with something she couldn't read. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. Tessa frowned. "For what?" "For not saying something, for letting him talk to you like that." "You don't owe me anything." "Maybe not, but I should have said something anyway." She stared at him, trying to understand. "Why do you care?" Luke's jaw tightened. For a long moment, he didn't answer. Then, so quietly she almost didn't hear it, he said, "Because I've been where you are, and I know what it costs to stand there alone." He turned and walked out before she could respond, leaving her sitting in the empty cookhouse with his words echoing in her ears and a strange, painful ache blooming in her chest. Tessa didn't sleep that night. She lay on the narrow cot in the room behind the cookhouse, staring at the ceiling beams while the wind rattled the shutters, and her mind replayed Rafe's words over and over like a knife turning in an old wound. She'd built walls around those memories, tall and thick, but it took so little to crack them. Just a name, just a sneer, just the weight of men's eyes deciding who she was based on where she'd been instead of who she'd become. By the time dawn broke, pale and cold, she was already dressed and moving. The stove lit, the coffee brewing, the rhythm of work her only anchor. The men came for breakfast in small groups, quieter than usual. They didn't meet her eyes. They took their plates, ate quickly, and left without lingering. Even Clem, who'd defended her the night before, kept his gaze fixed on his eggs like they held the secrets of the universe. Only Luke came alone. He slipped in through the back door just as the others were filing out, took his plate to the corner by the stove, and ate standing up the way he always did. But this time, when Tessa turned from the wash basin, she caught him watching her with that same careful look, like he was measuring something he couldn't say out loud. She dried her hands on her apron and walked over to him. "You meant what you said last night." Luke's jaw tightened. "I don't say things I don't mean." "Then tell me." She crossed her arms, holding his gaze. "Where have you been that makes you understand what it costs to stand alone?" For a moment she thought he'd shut down, the way men did when questions got too close to the truth. But instead, he set his plate on the ledge beside him and looked at her with eyes that held more weight than a man his age should carry. "I was at Antietam," he said quietly. "Sharpsburg, if you want the Maryland name for it. Bloodiest single day of the war. I was 19, thought I knew what courage looked like. Turned out I didn't know a damn thing." Tessa's breath caught. She'd heard stories about Antietam. Everyone had. 23,000 casualties in 12 hours. The cornfields soaked red. The bodies stacked like cordwood. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it. "Don't be." Luke's voice was flat, emotionless, the way people talk when the feeling's too big to let out. "I lived. That's more than most got. But I came back different. Came back knowing that standing silent when you should speak up is its own kind of cowardice, and it eats at you worse than any bullet." "Is that why you didn't sit with the others last night? Because you were ashamed you didn't speak up sooner?" "Partly." He picked up his plate again, his knuckles white around the edges. "And partly because I didn't trust what I'd do to Rafe if I stayed." The words hung in the cold air between them. Tessa studied his face, the hard line of his jaw, the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes had gone dark and distant. There was violence in him, she realized. Controlled, buried deep, but there all the same. The kind of violence that came from seeing too much and carrying it alone for too long. "Thank you," she said. "For the wood. For what you said. For not looking at me the way the others do." Luke's gaze snapped back to hers, sharp and searching. "How do the others look at you?" "Like I'm something that shouldn't be here. Like I'm taking up space I didn't earn." "You earned it the second you walked through that door and didn't flinch." His voice was rough, almost angry. "Don't let men like Rafe convince you otherwise." He handed her his plate, nodded once, and walked out before she could say another word. Tessa stood there holding the empty dish, her heart doing something complicated and uncomfortable in her chest. Luke McCrae was a puzzle she couldn't solve, a man who spoke in fragments and watched from shadows, who carried guilt like a second skin and showed kindness in ways so quiet she almost missed them. She didn't know what to do with that, so she did what she always did. She went back to work. The days that followed were strange and tense, like walking on ice that might crack at any moment. Rafe stayed away from the cookhouse, taking his meals at odd hours or skipping them entirely, but his presence hung over the ranch like smoke. The men were different around Tessa now, not cruel, but careful. They thanked her for the food. They cleared their own plates. They stopped cursing when she was in earshot. It should have felt like progress. Instead, it felt like pity. Tessa hated pity more than she hated cruelty. On the fourth day, she found a basket on the cookhouse step. It was there when she opened the door before dawn, sitting in the snow like an offering. Inside, a dozen eggs carefully packed in straw, a small sack of cornmeal, a twist of dried venison, and tucked beneath it all, a folded piece of paper with 2 words written in careful, blocky script. For you, no signature, no explanation. Tessa stood in the doorway, the cold air biting at her face, and stared at that basket like it was a live grenade. She knew who'd left it. Knew without asking, because there was only one man on this ranch who moved through the world that quietly, who helped without announcing it, who watched her with eyes that said, "I see you instead of I judge you." She picked up the basket and carried it inside, her throat tight. That evening, she made cornbread with honey and fried the eggs with the last of the salt pork. When Luke came for supper, late, as always, she set a plate in his usual corner and added an extra piece of cornbread, golden and steaming. He looked at it, looked at her. Something flickered across his face, surprise maybe, or gratitude, and he nodded. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" "You know for what." Luke's mouth twitched, almost a smile. "Then you're welcome." He ate standing up, the way he always did, and when he left he took his plate to the wash basin and set it down carefully, like it was something precious. Tessa watched him go and felt that uncomfortable thing in her chest twist a little tighter. The next morning, there was more wood stacked by the door. The morning after that, a small tin of lard appeared on the pantry shelf, tucked behind the flour where no one would notice unless they were looking. Tessa didn't say anything, didn't ask. But every time she found one of Luke's quiet gifts, she felt a little less alone in the cold. It couldn't last. Rafe Dillon had never been good at letting things go. It was a Saturday afternoon when everything came apart. Tessa was in the pantry taking inventory when she heard raised voices in the yard. She stepped to the window and saw Rafe and Luke squared off near the barn, their faces hard, their fists clenched. "You think you're some kind of hero?" Rafe's voice carried clear across the frozen ground. "Sneaking around, leaving her presence like a lovesick schoolboy?" "Mind your business, Rafe." "She is my business, all of ours. We got a right to know who we're eating with." "You know who she is. She's the cook. That's all you need to know." "That's not all I know, though, is it?" Rafe stepped closer, his grin sharp and mean. "I know where she came from. I know what she did. And I know you're too blinded by a pretty face to see what everyone else sees." "What's that?" "That she don't belong here." Luke's hand shot out so fast Tessa almost missed it. He grabbed Rafe by the front of his shirt, yanked him close, and spoke in a voice so low and deadly she felt it in her bones, even from a distance. "You say one more word about her," Luke said, "and I'll knock every tooth out of your head." Rafe laughed, but it sounded forced. Big talk from the boss's son playing cowboy. The words fell like stones into still water. Tessa's breath stopped. Boss's son. Luke's face went white, then red. He shoved Rafe backward so hard the man stumbled and fell into the snow. "My father's got nothing to do with this." "Doesn't he?" Rafe pushed himself up, brushing snow from his coat, his eyes glittering with triumph. "You've been pretending to be just another hand, but we all know the truth. You're Luke McCrae, the owner's boy, the one who went off to war and came back too good to sit at his own father's table. So you put on work clothes and play at being one of us, but you're not. You never were." Tessa felt like the ground had opened beneath her feet. Luke McCrae, the owner's son, the man who'd brought her firewood and eggs and cornmeal, wasn't just another ranch hand struggling to get by. He was the one who owned the land she stood on, the one who could fire her with a word, the one who'd been watching her from the shadows while wearing a mask she'd never thought to question. She stepped away from the window, her hands shaking. Luke's voice rose, raw and furious. "I work this ranch same as anyone. I earn my keep." "You earn your guilt, you mean?" Rafe's grin widened. "That's what this is really about, isn't it? Poor Luke, so torn up about the war, so desperate to prove he's not just living off his daddy's name. So you put on the costume and pretend you're just another broken-down cowboy. But you're still the boss's son. You still get to walk away whenever you want. The rest of us? We're stuck. Then leave." "Maybe I will, but not before everyone knows what a fraud you are." Luke swung. His fist connected with Rafe's jaw with a crack that echoed across the yard. Rafe went down hard, blood streaming from his split lip, his eyes wide with shock. Luke stood over him, chest heaving, his knuckles bloody. "Anyone else want to talk about things that aren't their business?" Luke's voice was quiet, but it carried. The handful of men who'd gathered to watch shifted uncomfortably. No one answered. Rafe spat blood into the snow and laughed, a wet, ugly sound. "You just made a big mistake, McCrae." "Wouldn't be my first." Luke turned and walked away, his shoulders rigid, his hands still clenched into fists. He didn't look at the cookhouse. Didn't look at the window where Tessa stood, her heart hammering, her mind spinning. She stepped back from the glass and sat down hard on the flour barrel, her legs suddenly too weak to hold her. Luke McCrae, the owner's son. All this time, she'd thought he understood, thought he knew what it meant to be on the outside, to fight for every scrap of respect, to stand alone in a world that didn't want you. But he didn't. He couldn't. Because no matter how hard he worked or how much he pretended, he had a name that protected him, a father who owned the ground beneath his feet, a future that didn't depend on the whims of men like Rafe Dillon. And he'd never told her. Tessa pressed her hands to her face and made herself breathe. She couldn't afford to fall apart. Not here. Not now. She had supper to make and dishes to wash and a job to keep, because unlike Luke McCrae, she didn't have anywhere else to go. So she stood up, smoothed her apron, and got back to work. But when Luke came to the cookhouse that evening, she didn't look at him. And when he set his empty plate by the wash basin, she didn't say thank you. He stood there for a long moment, waiting. Then quietly, he said, "Tessa." She didn't answer. "Tessa, I don't." Her voice was flat, cold. "Just don't. I need to explain." "You don't need to do anything, Mr. McCrae." She turned to face him, and the look in her eyes made him flinch. "You're the owner's son. You give the orders. I take them. That's how this works, isn't it?" "It's not like that." "Then what's it like?" She stepped toward him, her hands balled into fists. "You let me think you were just another hand. Let me tell you things, trust you with things, while you stood there knowing you could end this any time you wanted. Knowing you had power, I don't. That's what it's like, Luke. That's exactly what it's like." His face went pale. "I didn't tell you because I didn't want you to see me that way." "What way?" "Like someone who could hurt you." "You did hurt me." Her voice cracked just a little. "You lied." "I didn't lie. I just didn't tell me the truth. That's the same thing." She turned away, her throat tight. "Get out." "Tessa." "I said get out." For a moment, she thought he'd argue. Thought he'd push, the way men always pushed when they wanted something. But Luke just stood there, his shoulders slumped, his hands hanging at his sides like dead weight. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. Then he left. Tessa stood alone in the empty cookhouse, surrounded by the smell of cooling food and wood smoke, and let herself feel the full weight of the betrayal. Not because Luke had lied about who he was. She'd known men lie, known they wore masks, known they showed you only what they wanted you to see. No, what hurt was that she'd believed him, believed he was different, believed that the quiet gifts and careful looks meant he saw her as something more than a problem to solve or a charity case to pity. But he wasn't different. He was just better at hiding. The days that followed were brutal in ways that had nothing to do with the cold. Tessa cooked, served, cleaned, moved through the routine with mechanical precision, her face a mask, her heart locked down tight. The men ate in silence. Luke stopped coming to meals. And Rafe, sporting a purple bruise across his jaw and a chip on his shoulder the size of Montana, watched her with eyes that said, "I told you so." She ignored him, ignored all of them. At night, she lay on her cot and stared at the ceiling and told herself she didn't care. Told herself it didn't matter that Luke had stopped leaving gifts, that the woodpile stayed the same size, that the space where he used to stand by the stove was empty. She was good at lying to herself. On the 7th day, she found another basket. It was sitting on the cookhouse step in the pre-dawn dark, just like before. But this time, there was no food inside. Just a folded piece of paper, the edges worn like it had been carried in a pocket for days. Tessa picked it up with numb fingers and unfolded it in the lamplight. The handwriting was the same. Careful, blocky, almost childlike in its precision. But the words were different, longer, heavier. I can't undo what I didn't say. Can't make you trust me again. But I can tell you this. I've been a coward twice in my life. Once at Antietam, when I watched good men die and did nothing to stop it. And once at the Velvet Spur in Bannock, 3 years ago, when I watched a woman stand tall while men tried to tear her down, and I stayed silent because I was too afraid to make it worse. I didn't know your name then, didn't know where you'd go or what you'd become, but I remembered your face, remembered the way you looked at them, not with fear, but with fury, like you'd burn the whole place down before you'd let them break you. When you walked onto this ranch, I knew you, and I knew I'd failed you once already, so I didn't tell you who I was because I was afraid you'd see me the way I see myself, as the man who watched you suffer and did nothing. I'm sorry, Tessa, not for keeping my name quiet, but for being the kind of man who had to hide it in the first place. You don't owe me forgiveness, but you deserve the truth. And the truth is this: you're the bravest person on this ranch. You always have been. Tessa read the letter 3 times. Then she folded it carefully, tucked it into her apron pocket, and walked outside into the cold. The sky was just beginning to lighten, the stars fading into pale gray. She stood in the yard, her breath clouding in the frozen air, and looked toward the barn where she knew Luke would be, because he was always there before dawn, mucking stalls and mending tack, working himself to exhaustion like it was penance. She could go to him, could tell him she understood, could forgive him for the silence and the secret and the weight of a past they both carried. Or she could walk away, pack her things, leave before the hurt settled in too deep to dig out. Tessa stood there for a long time, the letter burning like a coal in her pocket, her heart at war with itself. Then she made her choice. She turned and walked to the barn. Luke was in the back stall, pitching hay with his sleeves rolled up and his face set in hard lines. He didn't notice her at first, didn't hear her footsteps in the straw. It was only when she cleared her throat that he looked up, and the expression that crossed his face, hope and fear tangled so tight she couldn't tell them apart, made her chest ache. "I read your letter," Tessa said. Luke set down the pitchfork, his hands trembling. And I need to know something." She stepped closer, close enough to see the shadows under his eyes, the exhaustion carved into the lines of his face. "That night at the Velvet Spur, what did you see?" His jaw clenched. "I saw a drunk cowboy grab your arm, saw him try to pull you into his lap while his friends laughed, saw you throw a pot of coffee in his face and tell him if he touched you again, you'd gut him where he sat. And what did you do?" "Nothing." The word came out like gravel. "I sat there with my drink and my cowardice and watched you walk back into that kitchen alone, and I've hated myself for it every day since." Tessa's throat tightened. She remembered that night, remembered the burn of humiliation, the weight of laughter, the way her hands had shaken so badly she'd dropped a plate and watched it shatter on the floor. "Why didn't you help me?" "Because I was afraid." Luke's voice cracked. "Afraid of making it worse, afraid of drawing attention, afraid of being the kind of man who stood up when everyone else sat down. I told myself it wasn't my fight, that you could handle it, that I'd just make things harder if I got involved. But the truth is, I was a coward, and you paid the price for it." Tessa stood very still, her hands balled into fists, her heart pounding. She could feel the anger rising, hot and sharp. Anger at Luke, at Rafe, at every man who'd ever watched her suffer, and called it not their problem. But underneath the anger was something else, something quieter and more complicated. "You think leaving me eggs and firewood makes up for it?" she asked. "No." Luke met her eyes, unflinching. "Nothing makes up for it. I just wanted you to know that someone sees you, someone knows what it costs to do what you do, and someone's sorry for not standing beside you when it mattered." The silence that followed was thick and heavy. Tessa felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them back, furious at herself for the weakness. "You should have told me," she said finally, "about who you are, about that night. You should have trusted me with the truth." "I know. And you should have hit Rafe a hell of a lot sooner." Luke's mouth twitched, almost a smile. "I know that too." Tessa stepped forward and shoved him, hard. He stumbled back, his eyes going wide. "Don't you ever lie to me again? Don't you ever hide who you are or what you've done or what you're afraid of? Because I've spent my whole life with men who think I can't handle the truth, and I'm done with it. You hear me? I hear you. Good. She shoved him again, softer this time. And stop acting like you're the only one who's got something to atone for. We've all got ghosts. You don't get to carry them alone. Luke's face crumpled, just for a second, and she saw the raw, aching grief beneath the stoic mask. Then he straightened, nodded, and said, "Yes, ma'am." They stood there in the cold barn, surrounded by the smell of hay and horses, and something shifted between them, something fragile and new, like the first thaw after a long winter. "I'm not going anywhere," Tessa said quietly. "Not because of Rafe. Not because of what happened at the spur. Not because of you. I'm staying because this is my job, and I earned it, and I'm not letting anyone take it from me. Understand?" "I understand." "But if you want to keep leaving me firewood," she added, her mouth quirking, "I won't stop you." Luke's shoulders sagged with relief. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet." Tessa turned to leave, then paused and looked back. "And Luke? Next time someone tries to tear me down, you don't ask my permission to defend me. You just do it." "Yes, ma'am," he said again, and this time there was something in his voice that hadn't been there before, something that sounded almost like hope. Tessa walked back to the cookhouse with Luke's words echoing in her head and something warm unfurling in her chest despite the bitter cold. The sun was climbing now, pale and distant, casting long shadows across the frozen yard. She had work to do, biscuits to make, coffee to brew, men to feed who still looked at her sideways. But for the first time since Rafe had spoken her past out loud like an accusation, she felt like she could breathe. The morning passed in the usual rhythm. Flour and lard and salt became biscuits. Water and fire became coffee. The men came, ate, and left with fewer words than usual but cleaner plates. Clem nodded to her as he passed. One of the younger hands, a boy named Tommy with gap teeth and nervous hands, mumbled, "Thank you, ma'am," so quietly she almost missed it. Small things. But they mattered. Luke didn't come for breakfast, didn't come for lunch either. Tessa told herself she wasn't watching for him, wasn't listening for his footsteps on the porch, wasn't bothered by the empty corner by the stove. But when the dinner bell rang, and he still hadn't appeared, she found herself standing at the window, scanning the yard with a knot of worry tightening in her stomach. "Looking for someone?" Tessa spun around. Rafe stood in the doorway, his bruised jaw purple and swollen, his eyes cold. She hadn't heard him come in, hadn't heard the door open. Her hand moved instinctively toward the knife in her apron pocket. "Supper's on the table," she said evenly. "Take a plate or don't. I don't care which." Rafe didn't move. "You and Luke have a nice chat this morning? That's none of your business." "Everything on this ranch is my business." He stepped inside, closing the door behind him, and Tessa's pulse kicked up. The cookhouse suddenly felt too small, the walls too close. "I've been here 6 years, worked through drought and debt and winters that killed half the herd. I've earned my place. But you show up out of nowhere and suddenly the boss's son is fighting over you like you're something precious." "I didn't ask him to fight. Didn't stop him either." Rafe's smile was sharp and mean. "You think you're special because Luke's got a soft spot for strays? You think that makes you safe? I think you should leave." "Or what? You'll throw coffee in my face? Tell me you'll gut me?" He laughed, but it was an ugly sound. "I know all about you, Tessa Crowley. Know where you came from, what you did, and I know women like you don't stay in the kitchen for long." Tessa's hand closed around the knife handle. "Get out! Make me!" For a heartbeat, the air between them crackled with violence. Tessa could feel it building, the same tension she'd felt 100 times before, in 100 different rooms with 100 different men who thought they had the right to take whatever they wanted just because she'd been born poor and female and unprotected. She could feel the weight of the knife in her hand, the cold fury rising in her chest, the part of her that had learned long ago how to fight when words stopped working. But then the door slammed open and Luke was there. He didn't say a word, just grabbed Rafe by the collar, hauled him backward, and threw him out into the snow so hard the man landed flat on his back with a grunt that knocked the air from his lungs. Luke stepped out after him, his face carved from stone, his hands curled into fists. "You go near her again," Luke said, his voice low and deadly calm. and I'll break more than your jaw. That clear? Rafe pushed himself up, spitting blood and snow. You're making a mistake, McCrae. Wouldn't be my first. Now get out of my sight before I make another one. Rafe looked like he wanted to argue, wanted to push back, wanted to make this into something bigger. But something in Luke's eyes, something cold and final, made him think better of it. He hauled himself to his feet, shot one last venomous look at Tessa through the open door, and stalked off toward the bunkhouse. Luke stood there for a long moment, his chest heaving, his fists still clenched. Then he turned and looked at Tessa, and the fury in his eyes softened into something that looked almost like fear. "Are you all right?" he asked. Tessa realized she was still holding the knife. She loosened her grip, slid it back into her pocket, and forced herself to breathe. "I'm fine." "He didn't touch you?" "No." Luke's shoulders sagged with relief. He stepped back inside, closed the door, and leaned against it like his legs might give out. "I should have been here. Should have come when the bell rang. He stopped, shook his head. "I'm sorry. You don't need to apologize. I can take care of myself." "I know you can." Luke's eyes met hers, dark and serious. "But you shouldn't have to. Not alone. Not anymore." The words settled between them, heavy with meaning. Tessa felt that warm thing in her chest expand, painful and sweet at the same time. She wanted to say something, to tell him that she understood, that she was grateful, that for the first time in her life someone had shown up when it mattered. But the words tangled in her throat, too big and too complicated to speak out loud. So instead she said, "You missed supper." Luke blinked, then smiled. A real smile, small and crooked and utterly genuine. "I did, didn't I? There's stew left, and biscuits." "Then I guess I'm in luck." Tessa served him a plate, her hand steady now, her heart still doing that uncomfortable thing but gentler this time. Luke took his usual spot in the corner by the stove, but tonight he didn't eat standing up. He pulled over a chair, sat down, and ate like a man who hadn't had a decent meal in days. When he finished, he set his plate by the wash basin and turned to her. "I talked to my father." Tessa looked up from the pot she was scrubbing. "About what?" "About Rafe. Told him what happened, what he said, what he did." Luke's jaw tightened. "My father's giving him a choice. Apologize and keep his job, or pack his things and leave by morning." "What do you think he'll choose?" "Knowing Rafe? He'll leave. His pride won't let him do anything else." Tessa wasn't sure how she felt about that. Part of her was relieved. Relieved she wouldn't have to see his sneering face, wouldn't have to watch her back every time she walked across the yard. But another part, the part that had learned to survive by being smarter and tougher than the men who tried to break her, felt almost disappointed. Because if Rafe left, it would be because Luke had forced him out, not because she'd beaten him on her own terms. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. "Yes, I did." Luke's voice was firm. "He crossed a line. He threatened you. And he's been poisoning the other men against you since the day he came back. This ranch can't function when half the hands are fighting the other half. And it sure as hell can't function when the cook doesn't feel safe in her own kitchen." "Your father agreed with that?" "My father agreed that Rafe's been trouble for a while now, and this was just the final straw." Luke hesitated, then added, "He also said I should have told him sooner about what Rafe said that first night, about how the men were treating you." "You didn't want to cause problems. I didn't want you to think I was pulling strings behind your back, but I should have trusted you to know the difference between helping and interfering." He ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. "I'm still figuring out how to do this." "Do what?" "Be honest. Be present. Be the kind of man who shows up instead of hiding." Tessa set down the pot and dried her hands on her apron. She crossed to where Luke stood, close enough to see the exhaustion in his face, the weight he carried in the set of his shoulders. "You showed up today. You showed up this morning in the barn. You showed up when it mattered. That's a low bar." "Maybe, but it's higher than most men clear." Luke's mouth quirked in a sad, wry smile. "Is that supposed to make me feel better?" "It's supposed to make you stop beating yourself up for things you can't change." Tessa's voice softened. "You can't go back to the Velvet Spur and undo what happened. You can't go back to Antietam and save the men you lost. All you can do is be here now, and you are. So stop punishing yourself for being human. Luke looked at her like she'd just said something in a language he was only beginning to understand. Then he nodded, once, and something in his expression eased. Thank you. For what? For not giving up on me. I haven't decided if I'm giving up on you or not, Tessa said, but there was no heat in it. Ask me again in a month. This time Luke's smile reached his eyes. The next morning, Rafe Dillon was gone. His bunk was empty, his gear cleared out, his horse missing from the barn. He'd left in the night without a word to anyone, and the only evidence he'd been there at all was the faint outline of his boots in the snow leading east toward the main road. The men seemed lighter somehow. They talked more at breakfast, laughed easier, didn't look over their shoulders like they were waiting for trouble. Even Clem cracked a joke, a terrible one about a horse and a preacher that made the younger hands groan, and the sound of laughter in the cookhouse felt like the first warm day after a hard winter. Tessa served them with a steady hand and a guarded heart, still waiting for the other boot to drop. But it didn't. The day passed quietly. The work got done. Evening came and the men had gone back to the bunkhouse. Luke appeared at the cookhouse door with an armload of fresh split wood and a question in his eyes. May I come in? You own the place, Tessa said. You don't need to ask. That's not how this works. Luke set the wood down by the stove. Not with you. She studied him for a moment, this man who was slowly becoming something more than a puzzle, something closer to a person she might actually trust. Then she nodded. Come in. He did. And for the first time since she'd arrived at Silver Ridge Ranch, they sat down at the table together, not as employer and employee, not as the owner's son and the woman from the Velvet Spur, but as two people who'd found each other in the cold and decided, against all sense and reason, to try. Over the next 2 weeks, something shifted on the ranch. It was subtle at first, small changes that Tessa noticed but didn't quite believe. The men started saying good morning when they came for breakfast. They asked how she was sleeping, if the roof was leaking, if she needed anything from town. Tommy, the gap-toothed boy, brought her a basket of wild turkey eggs he'd found in the brush. Clem fixed the hinge on the pantry door without being asked, and Luke kept coming. Not just for meals, though he did that too, sitting with the other men now instead of hiding in the corner. But he came at odd hours, when the cookhouse was empty and Tessa was elbow-deep in bread dough or stirring a pot of beans. He'd chop wood, or mend a broken chair, or simply sit at the table with a cup of coffee and talk to her about things that didn't matter, weather and horses and the way the light looked on the mountains at sunset. She learned things about him in those quiet hours. Learned that he'd grown up on this ranch but left at 17 to fight in a war that stole 4 years of his life and most of his innocence. Learned that he'd come back to find his mother dead and his father aged beyond recognition, the ranch struggling under debt and drought. Learned that he'd refused to take over, refused to use his name to give orders, because he didn't trust himself to lead men after failing them so completely on the battlefield. So I became a hand, Luke said one evening, his hands wrapped around a tin cup, his eyes distant. Figured, if I couldn't lead, at least I could work. At least I could prove I wasn't just living off my father's name. And did you? Tessa asked. Prove it? I don't know. Some days I think I'm just hiding, doing penance for things that can't be fixed. Is that what you think you're doing with me? Penance? Luke's gaze snapped to hers, sharp and startled. No, God, no. Being with you, talking to you, that's not penance. That's the first thing that's felt real since I came home. The words hung in the air between them, raw and honest. Tessa felt her chest tighten, felt that dangerous warmth spreading through her ribs again. She should pull back, should remind him, and herself, that this couldn't go anywhere, that she was still the woman from the Velvet Spur, and he was still the owner's son, and those two things didn't mix no matter how many quiet conversations they shared. But she didn't pull back. She stayed right where she was, across the table from him, and said, "Tell me about Antietam." Luke flinched like she'd struck him. Why? Because you carry it like an open wound, and I want to understand. For a long moment, she thought he'd refuse, thought he'd shut down the way he had the first few times she'd pushed too hard. But then he set down his cup and started talking. He told her about the cornfield, about the men who'd marched into it singing and come out in pieces if they came out at all. About the boy from Pennsylvania who'd been standing next to him 1 second and was gone the next. Just a red mist and a scream that Luke still heard in his dreams. About the orders that made no sense. The officers who threw lives away like they were betting chips. The terrible mathematics of war that traded bodies for ground and called it victory. I froze, Luke said, his voice flat and hollow. We were supposed to advance, and I just stood there. Couldn't move. Couldn't think. One of the other men grabbed me, pulled me forward, probably saved my life. But I didn't save anyone. I just survived. And I've spent every day since wondering why I got to walk away when better men didn't. Tessa reached across the table and took his hand. His fingers were rough and calloused, scarred from years of hard work, and they trembled slightly in her grip. You were 19 years old in the middle of hell. You don't get to blame yourself for being human. People died because I froze. People died because there was a war, because men with power sent boys to kill each other over things those boys had no say in. You didn't cause that. You just survived it. She squeezed his hand hard. And surviving doesn't make you a coward. It makes you lucky. And what you do with that luck. That's what matters. Luke's eyes were bright with unshed tears. What am I supposed to do with it? You're supposed to live. Tessa's voice was fierce. You're supposed to stop punishing yourself for being alive. You're supposed to show up and do the work and help people when you can. That's all any of us can do. He stared at her like she was speaking a truth he desperately wanted to believe but couldn't quite reach. Then, so quietly she almost didn't hear it, he said, You're remarkable. Tessa felt heat rise in her cheeks. I'm just a cook. You're not, though. You're the strongest person I've ever met. You've survived things that would have broken most people, and you're still here. Still fighting, still standing. His grip tightened on her hand. I see you, Tessa. I see what you've done, what you've overcome. And I think you're remarkable. The words hit her like a physical blow. Tessa had been called a lot of things in her life. Pretty when men wanted something, damaged when they were done, useful when they needed her skills. But remarkable. No one had ever called her that. No one had ever looked at her scars and seen strength instead of weakness. She pulled her hand back, suddenly overwhelmed. I should finish the dishes. Tessa, thank you, she said quickly, for saying that. But I need a minute. Luke nodded and stood, his face carefully neutral. Of course. I'll see you tomorrow. He left without another word, and Tessa sat at the empty table with her heart racing and her hands shaking, trying to make sense of the tangled mess of feelings knotting in her chest. She was falling for him. Against all her better judgment, against every hard-won lesson about trusting men, against the voice in her head that screamed this was dangerous and foolish and would only end in pain, she was falling for Luke McCrae. And she didn't know how to stop. Winter deepened, and with it came storms that buried the ranch in snow and ice. The men worked twice as hard to keep the stock alive, breaking ice on the water troughs, hauling hay through drifts that came up to their waists. Tessa kept the cookhouse warm and the food plentiful, stretching supplies with the skill of someone who'd learned to make miracles out of scraps. Luke worked harder than anyone. He was up before dawn and didn't stop until well after dark, his hands raw and bleeding from the cold, his face gaunt with exhaustion. Tessa watched him wear himself down and felt something twist painfully in her chest. She started setting aside extra food, the biggest portions, the best cuts of meat, the biscuits with the most butter. She left them in the corner by the stove where he always sat, and he ate them without comment, but sometimes she'd catch him looking at her with an expression that made her breath catch. One night, after a particularly brutal storm, Luke didn't come for supper at all. Tessa waited until the other men had eaten and left, then wrapped herself in her coat and went looking for him. She found him in the barn, slumped against a stall door with his head in his hands. He didn't look up when she approached. Luke? No answer. She knelt beside him, her heart hammering. Up close she could see he was shaking, not from cold, but from something deeper. Luke, what's wrong? Lost 3 calves today. His voice was barely a whisper. Froze to death before we could get to them. I should have moved them closer to the barn yesterday. Should have seen the storm coming, but I didn't, and now they're dead. That's not your fault, isn't it? I'm supposed to be running this place. Supposed to know better. But I keep failing. He looked up at her, his eyes haunted. How many things do I have to fail at before I just accept that I'm not good enough? Tessa felt anger flare hot and bright in her chest. She grabbed his face with both hands, forcing him to meet her eyes. Listen to me. 3 calves died because winter is brutal, and storms are unpredictable, and sometimes things die no matter how hard you work to save them. That's not failure. That's life. And if you're going to carry the weight of every bad thing that happens on this ranch, you'll break under it. Maybe I should. No. Her voice was sharp. You don't get to give up, not after everything you've survived, not after everything you've fought for. You hear me? Luke's hands came up to cover hers, his touch desperate. I'm so tired, Tessa. I'm so tired of trying and failing and trying again. I know, her voice softened. But you don't have to do it alone anymore. You have people here who care about you. Your father, the men, me. She swallowed hard. You have me. Something broke in his expression. He leaned forward and pressed his forehead against hers, his breath warm against her lips. I don't deserve you. That's not your call to make. They stayed like that for a long moment, breathing the same air, holding each other up in the cold dark. Then Luke pulled back, just enough to look at her, and his eyes were full of something so raw and vulnerable it made her ache. Can I kiss you? He asked, his voice rough. Tessa's heart stuttered. Every instinct she had screamed at her to say no, to pull away, to protect herself from the inevitable hurt. But she looked at this man, this broken, honest, trying so hard man, and all she could think was yes. Yes, she whispered. Luke kissed her like she was something precious, like she was worth the risk. His lips were cold at first, then warm, then burning. Tessa kissed him back with all the fear and hope and desperate longing she'd been holding at bay, her hands fisting in his coat, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Luke rested his forehead against hers again and said, I'm falling in love with you. Tessa closed her eyes. Luke, you don't have to say it back. I just need you to know, because I'm tired of hiding things from you, tired of pretending I don't feel what I feel. He cupped her face gently. I love you, Tessa Crowley. I love your strength and your courage and the way you fight for what's yours. I love that you don't take anyone's bullshit, including mine. And I love that you're here, right now, when you have every reason to walk away. Tears burned at the corners of her eyes. I'm scared. So am I. I don't know how to do this, how to trust someone this much. Then we'll figure it out together. Luke's thumb brushed across her cheek, catching a tear she hadn't meant to shed. I'm not asking you to be fearless. I'm just asking you to try. Tessa looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the man who'd brought her firewood in the dark, who'd defended her when it cost him, who'd confessed his worst failures because she'd asked him to. She saw the man who was still learning how to show up, still learning how to be brave, still fighting battles most people would never see. And she thought maybe, just maybe, she could try. Okay, she whispered. Okay? Okay, I'll try. But if you break my heart, Luke McCrae, I will never forgive you. He smiled, a real smile, bright and relieved and beautiful. Fair enough. They stayed in the barn until the cold drove them out, holding each other in the dark, 2 broken people trying to figure out how to be whole. And when they finally walked back to the cookhouse together, Tessa's hand tucked into the crook of Luke's arm, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. She felt hope. The days that followed carried a different weight. Not lighter, exactly, but steadier, like Tessa had found her footing on ground that had been shifting beneath her feet since she arrived. She and Luke didn't announce anything to the men, didn't hold hands at the breakfast table or steal kisses where others could see. But things changed in small, quiet ways that mattered. Luke came to the cookhouse every morning now, not sneaking in through the back, but walking through the front door with the other men. He sat at the table instead of standing in the corner. He talked more, laughed easier, looked at Tessa with eyes that held a warmth he no longer bothered to hide. And when the men left and they were alone, he'd help her with the dishes, their shoulders brushing, their hands touching in the soapy water, Neither of them saying much, but both of them feeling the weight of what had shifted between them. The men noticed. Of course they noticed. But they were careful about it. No crude jokes, no knowing looks, just a quiet acceptance that felt almost like respect. Clem started calling Luke by his first name instead of boss or Mr. McCrae, and that small shift seemed to give the others permission to do the same. Tommy asked Tessa if she needed help carrying water from the pump, his young face earnest and hopeful. Even the older hands, the ones who'd been coldest when she first arrived, nodded to her when they passed in the yard. It felt fragile, like ice forming over a river, beautiful but dangerous, liable to crack if you put too much weight on it. Tessa didn't trust it yet. Couldn't afford to. She'd learned too many times that acceptance could turn to cruelty in a heartbeat, that men who smiled at you one day could spit at your feet the next if the wind changed direction. But she wanted to trust it. God, how she wanted to. 3 weeks after the night in the barn, the supply wagon came through from town. The driver, a grizzled man named Hank with tobacco-stained teeth and suspicious eyes, unloaded flour and salt and coffee with the efficiency of someone who'd done this route 1,000 times. He handed Tessa the receipt to sign, his gaze sliding over her in a way that made her skin crawl. "You're the new cook," he said. It wasn't a question. "I am." "Heard about you. Heard you worked at the Velvet Spur over in Bannack." Tessa's hand tightened on the pencil. Here it was again, the past rising up like a ghost she couldn't outrun. She kept her voice level. "I worked a lot of places. The Spur was one of them. Rough place, that. Rougher crowd." Hank spat a stream of tobacco juice into the snow. "Takes a certain kind of woman to survive a place like that." "Takes a certain kind of woman to survive anywhere," Tessa said flatly. She signed the receipt and shoved it back at him. "Your payment's with Mr. McCrae. You'll need to see him before you leave." Hank took the paper, his eyes narrowing. "Touchy, ain't you?" "I'm busy. You want to chat? Find someone else." She turned to go back inside, but Hank's voice followed her. "Word of advice, miss. Men out here got long memories. You might have moved on, but that don't mean folks have forgotten where you came from." Tessa stopped, her hand on the doorframe. She looked back over her shoulder, and the expression on her face made Hank take a step back. "Let me give you some advice in return. I don't care what folks remember. I care about doing my job and being left alone to do it. So unless you've got business here that involves delivering supplies, I suggest you keep your memories to yourself." She went inside and slammed the door hard enough to rattle the frame. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against the table and forced herself to breathe, counting slowly until the rage subsided enough for her to think clearly. It didn't matter what Hank said. Didn't matter what he remembered or what he'd heard. She'd survived worse than gossip, survived worse than judgment. But it still hurt. The door opened quietly behind her. She didn't turn around, but she knew it was Luke by the careful weight of his footsteps. "I saw Hank leaving," Luke said. "He say something to you?" "Nothing I haven't heard before." "Tessa." His voice was gentle but firm. "What did he say?" She turned to face him, her arms crossed over her chest like armor. "He reminded me that people have long memories. That's all." Luke's jaw tightened. "I'll talk to him." "No." "Tessa." "I said no." She stepped toward him, her eyes blazing. "I don't need you to fight every battle for me. I don't need you to defend my honor or threaten people who say things I don't like. I need you to trust that I can handle it myself." "I do trust you, but that doesn't mean you should have to handle it alone." "Then what do you want me to do, Luke? Let you punch everyone who brings up my past? Let you play the hero while I hide behind you?" Her voice cracked. "That's not who I am. I can't be the woman who needs saving every time someone says something cruel. I won't be that woman." Luke reached for her, then stopped, his hands hovering in the air between them, like he didn't know if touching her would help or make things worse. "I'm not trying to save you. I'm trying to stand beside you. There's a difference." "Is there?" "Because from where I'm standing, it looks an awful lot like you think I'm too weak to fight my own fights." "That's not—" He stopped, took a breath, tried again. "I don't think you're weak. I think you're the strongest person I know. But being strong doesn't mean you have to be alone. It doesn't mean you can't let people help you." Tessa felt tears prickling at her eyes and hated herself for it. She turned away, blinking hard. I'm scared.
Of what? Of needing you.
The words came out barely above a whisper. Of getting used to having someone stand beside me and then losing it. Because people always leave, Luke. They always find a reason. And when they do, I'm the one left standing alone, trying to remember how to be strong without them. Luke moved closer, slow and careful, like approaching a wounded animal. He didn't touch her, just stood near enough that she could feel the warmth of him, the solid presence that had become so familiar these past weeks. I'm not going anywhere. You can't promise that. You're right. I can't promise I'll never fail you. Can't promise I'll always say the right thing or do the right thing. But I can promise I'll keep showing up, keep trying, keep standing beside you, even when it's hard. His voice dropped, rough with emotion. You don't have to trust me yet, but give me the chance to earn it. Tessa turned to look at him, and the expression on his face, open and vulnerable and utterly sincere, made something crack in her chest. She'd spent so long building walls, so long protecting herself from the hurt that came with letting people in. But Luke was patient. Luke was steady. Luke was the first man who'd ever looked at her scars and said, I see you instead of I pity you. I'm trying, she said softly. I'm trying to trust you. But you have to understand, it doesn't come easy for me. I know, and I'm not asking for easy, I'm just asking for a chance. She nodded slowly, and some of the tension in Luke's shoulders eased. He reached out carefully, giving her time to pull away, and when she didn't, he took her hand and laced their fingers together. Thank you, he said. For what? For trying. That's all I can ask for. They stood like that for a long moment, holding on to each other in the quiet cookhouse, two people learning how to let down their guards without losing themselves in the process. The winter wore on, brutal and unforgiving. 2 more storms buried the ranch in snow, and the men worked themselves to exhaustion keeping the livestock alive. Tessa kept the cookhouse running on sheer will and determination, stretching supplies that should have run out weeks ago, making meals out of whatever she could scrounge. The men ate without complaint, their respect for her growing with every biscuit she pulled from the oven, every pot of stew she stretched to feed 15 hungry mouths. And through it all, Luke was there. Not hovering, not suffocating, just present. He chopped wood without being asked. He fixed things that broke. He made sure she had enough water hauled from the pump so she didn't have to carry it herself in the freezing cold. Small things, quiet things, but they mattered. One evening in late February, Tessa was banking the fire for the night when she heard shouting outside. She froze, her hand on the poker, listening. Men's voices, angry and overlapping. Then the sound of something shattering, glass, maybe, or pottery. She grabbed her coat and ran outside. The yard was chaos. 6 men stood in a rough circle near the barn, their faces illuminated by lantern light, their voices raised. In the center of the circle, Luke and another man, one of the newer hands, a surly drifter named Garrett, were squared off, their fists clenched, their eyes locked. I said you're done, Luke said, his voice hard and cold. Pack your things and get off this ranch. You can't fire me, Garrett snarled. I got a contract. Your contract says you work for this ranch, and this ranch has rules. One of them is you don't steal from your fellow hands, so either you leave on your own 2 feet or I throw you off. Your choice. I didn't steal nothing. Then explain why Tommy's wages are missing from his bunk. Explain why 3 other men have complained about things going missing in the past 2 weeks. Luke stepped forward, his voice dropping to something deadly. You think I'm stupid? You think I don't notice when a man's pockets are heavier than they should be and everyone else is coming up short? Garrett's face twisted with rage. You're just like your old man. Think you're better than the rest of us. Think you can push us around because you got a fancy name. I think I can push you around because you're a thief and a liar. Luke's hands curled into fists. Now get off my land before I make you. For a moment, Tessa thought Garrett would swing. Thought this would turn into the kind of ugly brawl she'd seen too many times in too many places. But then Clem stepped forward, his face hard, and 2 other men moved to flank him. The message was clear. If Garrett started something, he'd be facing more than just Luke. Garrett must have seen it too because he spat in the snow and backed down. Fine, but don't expect me to stay quiet about this place, about the kind of men you hire. His eyes found Tessa standing in the doorway of the cookhouse, and his sneer widened. About the kind of women you keep around. Luke moved so fast Tessa didn't see it coming. 1 second Garrett was standing, the next he was flat on his back in the snow, with Luke's knee on his chest and Luke's fist drawn back to strike. "Say one more word about her," Luke said, his voice shaking with barely controlled fury, "and I'll knock your teeth so far down your throat you'll be spitting them out for a week." "Luke," Tessa's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Let him go." Luke's head snapped toward her, his eyes wild. "Tessa, I said let him go. He's not worth it." For a long, breathless moment, Luke didn't move. Then, slowly, he pulled back and stood, his chest heaving. Garrett scrambled to his feet, his face red, his eyes murderous. "You're all crazy," Garrett spat. "This whole place is run by a coward pretending to be a man and a whore pretending to be respectable. Hope you're happy together." He stalked off toward the bunkhouse, and the men watched him go in tense silence. No one spoke. No one moved. Then Clem cleared his throat. "I'll make sure he's gone by morning," he said quietly. Luke nodded, his jaw still tight. "Thank you." The men dispersed slowly, heading back to the bunkhouse or the barn, leaving Luke standing alone in the yard with his hands still clenched into fists. Tessa walked over to him, her boots crunching in the snow. "You all right?" she asked. "I should have thrown him out sooner, should have seen he was trouble." "You saw it when it mattered, that's enough." Luke looked at her, his eyes dark with something that might have been shame or anger or both. "He called you a whore." "He's not the first. Won't be the last. That doesn't make it right." "No, but it also doesn't matter." Tessa reached up and took his face in her hands, forcing him to meet her eyes. "What matters is that you stood up for me, that the other men stood with you, that Garrett's leaving and we're staying. That's what matters." Luke's hands came up to cover hers, his touch gentle despite the violence still thrumming through him. "I hate that you have to deal with men like him. I've been dealing with men like him my whole life, but for the first time, I've got people who won't let me stand alone." She smiled, small and fierce. "That's worth something." Luke pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her like he could shield her from the cruelty of the world through sheer force of will. Tessa let herself lean into him, let herself take comfort in the solid warmth of his body, the steady beat of his heart against her cheek. "I love you," he said into her hair. "I know," she whispered. And then, because those words were rising up her throat and she couldn't hold them back anymore, she added, "I think I love you too." Luke pulled back just enough to look at her, his eyes wide with surprise and hope. "You think?" "I'm still figuring it out, but yeah, I think I do." His smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, slow and warm and beautiful. "That's good enough for me." They stood like that in the frozen yard, holding each other while the wind howled and the stars wheeled overhead, two people who'd found something precious in the cold and were determined not to let it go. The next morning, Garrett was gone. His bunk was empty, his gear cleared out, his horse missing from the barn. No one mentioned him at breakfast. No one asked where he'd gone or why. It was like he'd never existed at all. But something had shifted in the men. Tessa could see it in the way they looked at Luke, not with the careful deference they'd shown before, but with something closer to loyalty. Luke had drawn a line, made it clear what he would and wouldn't tolerate, and the men respected him for it. More than that, they respected the fact that he'd drawn that line to protect one of their own, because somewhere along the way, without Tessa quite noticing, she'd become one of their own. It was a week later when the real trouble started. Tessa was in the cookhouse, kneading bread dough, when she heard the creak of wood behind her. She turned, expecting Luke or one of the hands, and found instead a stranger standing in the doorway, a tall man with a thick beard and cold eyes, his coat dusty from travel. "Help you?" Tessa asked, her hand moving instinctively toward the knife in her apron. "Looking for Luke McCrae," the man said. His voice was flat, empty of warmth. "Heard he's here." "He's out with the herd, won't be back until evening." "I'll wait." "Cookhouse isn't for waiting. There's a bench outside the main house if you need to sit." The man's eyes narrowed. "You always this unwelcoming to visitors?" "I'm welcoming to people who state their business and don't walk into my kitchen uninvited." The man studied her for a long moment, and something in his gaze made Tessa's skin crawl. It was the look of someone evaluating, calculating, deciding how much of a problem she'd be. Then he smiled, and it was worse than the cold stare. "You must be the cook everyone's been talking about, Tessa Crowley, right?" She didn't answer. "Heard you came from Bannock. Heard you worked at the Velvet Spur." He stepped further inside, and Tessa's grip tightened on the knife. "Small world. I knew a man who used to drink there. Said there was a woman working the kitchen, pretty thing with a sharp tongue and a talent for making men feel like less than nothing. That you? I think you should leave. I think I'll stay right here until Luke gets back. See, I got business with him. Important business. And I don't much care what some kitchen girl thinks about it." Tessa pulled the knife free and held it low and steady. "Get out of my cookhouse. Now." The man laughed. "You gonna stab me, little girl? That how you solve your problems?" "If I have to." They stared at each other across the small space, the tension thick enough to choke on. Then the door burst open and Luke was there, his face white with fury. "Dawson!" Luke's voice was ice. "What the hell are you doing here?" The man, Dawson, turned, his smile widening. "McCrae, been a long time." "Not long enough. I told you 2 years ago you're not welcome on this ranch. That was before your daddy owed me money. Now I'm back to collect." Luke's jaw tightened. "Whatever my father owes you, we'll settle it. But you don't come into this cookhouse. You don't talk to Tessa. You don't so much as look at her. Understand?" Dawson's eyes slid back to Tessa, cold and calculating. "Protective, aren't you? She must be special." "She is. And you're leaving. Now." "Not until I get what I'm owed." Luke stepped forward, his hands clenched. "Then you can wait outside while I get my father. But if I catch you near this cookhouse again, if I catch you anywhere near Tessa, I'll put you in the ground myself." Dawson held his gaze for a long, tense moment. Then he shrugged and sauntered toward the door. "Fine. But this isn't over, McCrae. Your daddy's got debts, and they're coming due. You might want to remind him that some men don't take kindly to being strung along." He left, and Luke turned immediately to Tessa. "Are you all right? Did he touch you?" "I'm fine. Just came in asking for you." She set the knife down, her hands shaking now that the danger had passed. "Who is he?" Luke's face was grim. "Trouble. The kind we don't need." "Luke, what did he mean about your father owing money?" "It's complicated." "Then uncomplicate it." Luke ran a hand through his hair, frustrated and exhausted. "My father took a loan from Dawson 3 years ago when we were having a bad year. Thought he could pay it back after the spring sales. But the sales didn't go as planned, and Dawson started charging interest. Steep interest. By the time I came back from the war, the debt had tripled, and Dawson was threatening to take the ranch." Tessa felt ice settle in her stomach. "How bad is it?" "Bad enough that we're barely keeping ahead of it. Every year we make just enough to pay the interest and keep him from foreclosing, but we're not making progress on the principal. If we have another bad year, or if he decides to call in the full debt," Luke's voice trailed off, "you could lose the ranch." "Yeah." Tessa crossed to him and took his hands. They were cold, trembling slightly. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because it's my problem, my father's problem, not yours. If it affects you, it affects me. That's how this works, remember?" She squeezed his hands. "We're in this together, so tell me, what can we do?" Luke looked at her with something like wonder. "You're not running?" "Why would I run?" "Because this ranch might not exist 6 months from now, because I might lose everything, because getting involved with me means getting involved with this mess." Tessa cupped his face, her eyes fierce. "I didn't fall in love with a ranch, Luke McCrae. I fell in love with you. So unless you're planning on disappearing in 6 months, I'm staying right here." Luke's breath caught. "You said you loved me." "I did, didn't I?" "Say it again." "I love you." The words came easier this time, softer. "I love you, and I'm not going anywhere, so we're going to figure this out. Together." Luke kissed her then, hard and desperate and full of gratitude. When they pulled apart, he rested his forehead against hers and said, "I don't deserve you." "Probably not, but you're stuck with me anyway." They stood like that in the cookhouse, holding each other while the threat of losing everything hung over their heads like a storm cloud. But for the first time since Dawson had walked through that door, Tessa felt something other than fear. She felt ready to fight. That evening, Luke brought his father to the cookhouse after the men had eaten and gone. Old Mr. McCrae looked smaller than Tessa remembered from that first encounter at the main house. His shoulders bowed, his face lined with worry that had carved itself into his features and taken up permanent residence. He removed his hat when he entered and nodded to her with a respect that felt both surprising and sad. "Miss Crowley," he said, "Luke tells me you want to help with our situation." "If I can, sir." Mr. McCrae sank into a chair like his bones ached. "Not sure there's much help to be had. Dawson's got us over a barrel, and he knows it. I made a bad choice 3 years ago, thought I could manage it, and now—" He gestured vaguely, helplessly. "Now my pride might cost my son his inheritance." Luke sat down beside his father, his jaw tight. "It's not about inheritance. It's about keeping the ranch running, keeping the men employed, keeping what you built from falling into Dawson's hands." "What exactly does he want?" Tessa asked, pulling out a chair across from them. "What's the total debt?" Mr. McCrae's face went red. "That's not— We shouldn't burden you with—" "I asked because I want to know, and because hiding it won't make it go away." The old man looked at Luke, who nodded. Mr. McCrae sighed and pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket. "Original loan was $800. With the interest Dawson's been charging, 30%, which is damn near criminal, we now owe him $2,200, due in full by 1st of April, or he takes the ranch." Tessa's breath caught. $2,200. It might as well have been $22,000. That was more money than most people saw in a lifetime. More money than a struggling ranch could pull together in 6 weeks, even if they sold everything that wasn't nailed down. "What about the spring cattle sale?" she asked. "Won't be enough. We'll get maybe 1,000 if we're lucky, and that's if the buyers show up and the market holds. Still leaves us 1,200 short." Luke's voice was flat, defeated. "We've been trying to figure out a way for months. Talked to the bank about a loan, but they won't touch us. Too risky with Dawson's claim hanging over the title. Tried to negotiate with Dawson, but he won't budge on the terms." "What about selling part of the land?" "Dawson owns the note on the whole ranch. We can't sell pieces without his permission, and he won't give it. He wants it all." Tessa sat back, her mind racing. There had to be a way. Had to be something they could do. She thought about the cookhouse, about the meals she'd stretched and the supplies she'd managed, about making something out of nothing because there was no other choice. This was just another problem that needed solving. Just another impossible situation that required creativity instead of surrender. "What if we brought in more income?" she said slowly. "What if the ranch made more money between now and April?" Luke shook his head. "There's no way. We're already working every angle. Cattle, horses. We even hired out some of the men for work on neighboring ranches. There's nothing left to squeeze." "What about the cookhouse?" Both men looked at her. "What about it?" Mr. McCrae asked. "What if we opened it up? Made it a way station for travelers on the road to Helena, hot meals, a warm place to rest. The old cattle trail runs right past here. There must be dozens of people passing through every week. Freight drivers, prospectors, families heading to the mining camps. They'd pay for a decent meal and a place to warm up." Luke frowned. "Tessa, that's a lot of extra work. You're already cooking for 15 men 3 times a day." "I can handle it. I've cooked for more in worse conditions." She leaned forward, her eyes bright. "Think about it. If we charge 50 cents a meal and we get even 10 people a day, that's $5. Over 6 weeks, that's over $200. It's not enough to cover the whole debt, but combined with the cattle sale, it might be enough to negotiate," Mr. McCrae said quietly. His eyes had gone sharp, calculating. "If we can show Dawson we're bringing in additional income, show him the ranch is viable, he might agree to extend the terms or reduce the principal." "He might," Luke said, but he didn't sound convinced. "Or he might just take the extra money and still demand the rest." "Then we make sure we have the rest." Tessa's voice was firm. "We work every angle. The way station, the cattle sale, anything else we can think of. We fight for this place like it's worth fighting for." Luke looked at her, something fierce and grateful burning in his eyes. "You're serious about this?" "Dead serious. This is your home. Your father's legacy. I'm not letting Dawson take it without a fight." Mr. McCrae cleared his throat, and when Tessa looked at him, she saw his eyes were wet. Miss Crowley, I don't know what my son did to deserve you, but I'm grateful for it. If you think this can work, I'm willing to try. Then we start tomorrow, Tessa said. We'll need to get word out, maybe put up signs in town, tell the freight drivers, spread the news at the trading posts, and we'll need supplies, more flour, more coffee, more everything. Can we manage that? We can extend credit at the general store, Luke said. Miller owes us a favor. He'll work with us. And I can ride into town tomorrow, start spreading word. Good. Then let's do it. They talked for another hour, planning and calculating and figuring out logistics. By the time Mr. McCrae left, heading back to the main house with his shoulders a little straighter and his step a little lighter, Tessa felt exhausted and exhilarated at the same time. This was a long shot. This was desperation dressed up as a plan. But it was something, and something was better than nothing. After his father left, Luke pulled Tessa close and held her like she was the only solid thing in a world that had started to shift beneath his feet. "Thank you," he said into her hair. "Don't thank me yet. We don't know if it'll work." "Doesn't matter. You didn't run. You could have, and I wouldn't have blamed you. But you stayed, and you're fighting for this place like it's yours. That means everything." Tessa pulled back to look at him. "It is mine. Or it will be, if you'll have me." Luke's breath caught. "Tessa, I'm not asking you to marry me right now," she said quickly, her cheeks flushing. "I'm just saying that whatever happens with the ranch, I'm here. I'm with you, for as long as you want me." Luke cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing her cheekbones. "I'll want you forever. You know that, right?" "I'm starting to believe it." He kissed her then, slow and sweet and full of promise. And for a moment, in the warm glow of the cookhouse, with the stove crackling and the smell of bread still hanging in the air, Tessa let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, they could actually win this fight. The next morning, Luke rode to town before dawn. Tessa spent the day preparing, cleaning the cookhouse until it shone, organizing the pantry, making lists of what they'd need and how much they could realistically feed with what they had. The men noticed the activity and asked questions, and when Tessa explained the plan, they didn't laugh or dismiss it. They rolled up their sleeves and helped. Clem built additional benches for seating, Tommy hauled extra water and chopped wood until there was a mountain of it stacked by the door. Even the older hands, the ones who'd been slowest to accept her, pitched in, repairing the porch steps, fixing a broken shutter, making sure the cookhouse was ready for whatever was coming. By the time Luke returned that evening, tired and dusty but with a spark of hope in his eyes, the cookhouse looked like a proper establishment. He stood in the doorway, taking it all in, and shook his head in wonder. "You did all this in one day?" "We did," Tessa corrected. "The men helped. They want to save this place too." Luke's throat worked. "I spread the word in town, talked to Miller, talked to the freight companies, even put up notices at the saloon and the church. Miller says he'll extend credit for supplies, and the freighters promised to tell their drivers. We should start seeing people within a few days." "Then we're ready." The first travelers arrived 3 days later, a family heading north to the goldfields, hungry and cold and grateful for hot food and a warm fire. Tessa served them beef stew and fresh bread and coffee, strong enough to wake the dead, and they paid their 50 cents with smiles and thanks and promises to spread the word. 2 days after that, a freight wagon stopped, and the driver brought his whole crew, 8 men who ate like they'd been starving and paid without complaint. Word spread fast on the frontier. Within 2 weeks, the cookhouse was serving 20 to 30 travelers a day, sometimes more. Tessa worked from before dawn until well after dark, her hands raw and her back aching, but the money box behind the counter was filling. Slowly, steadily, filling. Luke worked beside her when he could, serving food and clearing tables and making sure no one gave her trouble. The ranch hands helped too, taking turns assisting in the cookhouse between their regular duties. It became a point of pride. This was their ranch, their cookhouse, their fight. And they were winning. But not everyone was happy about it. Dawson showed up on a cold morning in mid-March, his face dark with anger. He pushed through the door while Tessa was serving breakfast to a group of prospectors, his eyes scanning the crowded room with unconcealed rage. "What the hell is this?" he demanded. Tessa set down the coffee pot and turned to face him. "This is a way station. We serve meals to travelers. You need something?" I need to know what kind of game you're playing. Dawson stalked toward her, and several of the prospectors stood up, their hands moving to their belts. He stopped, eyeing them warily. This is my ranch, or it will be in 2 weeks. It's not your ranch yet, Tessa said calmly. And if we have anything to say about it, it never will be. You think serving a few meals is going to save this place? You think I'm going to let you weasel out of what's owed? I think we're going to pay you what's owed, every penny, and then you're going to leave and never come back. Dawson's laugh was ugly. You got $2,200, sweetheart? Because that's what it'll take. We'll have it. Bullshit. Luke appeared in the doorway, his face hard. I think the lady asked you to leave, Dawson. This is between me and your father. No, it's between you and all of us. And we're done with you walking onto our land and making threats. Luke stepped fully inside, and Clem and 2 other hands moved to flank him. You'll get your money on April 1st. Until then, stay away from this ranch, stay away from this cookhouse, and stay the hell away from Tessa. That clear? Dawson looked around at the men, at the hostile faces, at the prospectors who were now openly holding their pistols. He was outnumbered, and he knew it. His face went red, then white, then red again. You'll regret this, McCrae, he said finally. All of you will. He turned and stalked out, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled. Tessa let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. One of the prospectors, a weathered man with kind eyes, spoke up. That man give you trouble regular? He's trying to take the ranch, Tessa said. We're trying to stop him. The prospector nodded slowly. Well, hell, in that case, breakfast is on me today, for the whole crew. He pulled out a silver dollar and set it on the counter. Keep the change, and if that bastard comes back, you send word to the mining camp. We'll come down and have a talk with him. Tessa felt tears prick her eyes. Thank you. Thank you, ma'am. Best meal I've had in 6 months. Worth fighting for. The days blurred together after that. Tessa cooked until her hands were blistered and her feet screamed. The money box filled, 1 coin at a time. Luke worked himself to exhaustion, managing the ranch and helping in the cookhouse and riding to town twice a week to check on the cattle sale arrangements. Mr. McCrae, who'd been broken and defeated just weeks ago, walked taller now, his eyes bright with something that looked like hope. The night before April 1st, Tessa and Luke sat in the empty cookhouse and counted the money. They'd done it 3 times already, but they counted again, just to be sure. The coins and bills spread across the table represented weeks of brutal work, of sacrifice, of choosing to fight instead of surrender. $1,940, Luke said, his voice hollow. We're still $260 short. Tessa's heart sank. They'd known it would be close, had hoped the cattle sale would cover the difference. But the buyers had come in lower than expected, and even with the way station bringing in steady income, they'd fallen short. We can ask Dawson for more time, she said. But even as she said it, she knew it was futile. Dawson wanted the ranch, not the money. He'd use any excuse to take it. Luke dropped his head into his hands. We tried. God, we tried so hard. The door opened and Mr. McCrae came in, his face grave. Counted? We're short, Luke said. 260. The old man nodded slowly like he'd expected this. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather pouch. He set it on the table, and it clinked heavily. What's this? Tessa asked. My mother's jewelry, wedding ring, some other pieces she left me. Been holding on to them for 40 years, waiting for the right time. He pushed the pouch toward Luke. This is the right time. Dad, no, I can't. Those are all you have left of her. What I have left of her is this ranch, the land she helped me build, the legacy she wanted to pass down. She'd understand. Mr. McCrae's voice was firm. Take it to Miller in the morning. He'll give you fair value. Should be enough to cover what we're short. Luke stared at the pouch like it was burning him. There has to be another way. There isn't, and I'm at peace with it. Your mother would be too. He looked at Tessa. She'd have liked you, Miss Crowley. She'd have liked your fire. Tessa's throat was too tight to speak. She could only nod. That night, she and Luke lay together in her small room behind the cookhouse, holding each other in the dark. Neither of them could sleep. Tomorrow, everything would change. Either they'd save the ranch, or they'd lose it all. There was no middle ground. I'm scared, Luke whispered. Me too. What if it's not enough? What if Dawson finds some way to, then we'll figure something else out. We'll start over somewhere else. But we'll do it together. Tessa turned to face him, her hand on his chest, feeling his heart beat fast and hard beneath her palm. I meant what I said. I'm with you, no matter what happens tomorrow. Luke kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. Marry me. Tessa went still. What? Marry me. Not after this is over, not someday when things are settled. Now, today. Before we face Dawson, before we know how this ends. His voice was urgent, desperate. I want you to be my wife. Want everyone to know you're mine and I'm yours, no matter what comes next. Luke, that's crazy. Maybe, but I've been a coward twice in my life, and I'm done with it. I'm done waiting. I'm done being afraid. I love you, Tessa Crowley, and I want to marry you right now. Tessa felt tears streaming down her face. There's no preacher, no ring, don't need a preacher, don't need a ring, just need you. He sat up, pulling her with him. Say yes. Please say yes. She looked at this man, this broken, beautiful, trying so hard man who'd shown up for her again and again, who'd fought for her, who'd chosen her when she'd been certain no one ever would. And she thought about all the years she'd spent alone, all the times she'd convinced herself she didn't need anyone, all the walls she'd built to keep the hurt out. Luke had walked through those walls like they were made of paper, and she was done fighting it. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I'll marry you. Luke's face broke into the most beautiful smile she'd ever seen. He kissed her hard, then jumped up and started pulling on his clothes. Get dressed. We're doing this right now. Right now? It's the middle of the night. Don't care. Come on. They dressed quickly and ran through the cold dark to the main house. Luke pounded on the door until his father appeared, bleary-eyed and confused. What in God's name? I'm marrying Tessa right now. Will you witness it? Mr. McCrae blinked. Then he smiled, slow and warm. About damn time. Let me get my coat. They gathered in the parlor. Luke and Tessa, Mr. McCrae and Clem, who Luke had dragged from the bunkhouse and who looked equal parts bewildered and delighted. There was no preacher, no formal ceremony, just Luke taking Tessa's hands in his and saying the words that mattered. I, Luke McCrae, take you, Tessa Crowley, to be my wife. I promise to stand beside you, to show up when it matters, to be honest even when it's hard. I promise to see you, all of you, and to love every piece, even the broken ones. I promise to fight for you, for us, for the life we're building together. Until the day I die, you're mine and I'm yours. Tessa's voice shook when she spoke, but the words were clear. I, Tessa Crowley, take you, Luke McCrae, to be my husband. I promise to trust you, even when it scares me. I promise to let you stand beside me, to let you help carry the weight. I promise to fight for this, for us, with everything I have. And I promise that no matter what comes tomorrow, no matter what comes ever, I won't run. I'm yours. Forever. Luke pulled a handkerchief from his pocket, clean white cotton, soft with age, and tied it gently around her wrist. He'd stitched a word into it in careful red thread, and when Tessa looked down and saw what it said, she started crying again. Forgiven. You don't have to carry your past anymore, Luke said softly. Not alone. We carry it together now. They kissed as husband and wife in that cold parlor with 2 witnesses and no music and no flowers, and it was the most perfect moment of Tessa's life. The next morning, they went to meet Dawson. He was waiting in front of the main house, his face smug, a legal document in his hands. Right on time. I'll take the payment now, or the deed to the ranch. Your choice. Luke stepped forward and set a leather satchel on the porch. $2,200. Count it. Dawson's smile faltered. He opened the satchel, his hands moving through the bills and coins, his face growing darker with each passing second. When he finished, he looked up, and the rage in his eyes was terrifying. This doesn't change anything, he said. I'll find another way to take this place from you. No, you won't. Mr. McCrae stepped forward, his voice hard. The debt is paid. You have no claim here. And if you come back, if you threaten my family or my ranch or anyone who works here, I'll make sure every rancher, every businessman, every person with influence in this territory knows exactly what kind of man you are, how you prey on people's desperation, how you charge criminal interest and use legal tricks to steal their land. You'll never do business in Montana again. That clear? Dawson's face went white, then red. He grabbed the satchel and stalked toward his horse. But before he mounted, he turned back, and his eyes found Tessa. You think you've won something, girl? You think this makes you respectable? You're still the woman from the velvet spur that never changes. Tessa stepped forward, her head high, Luke's hand solid and warm in hers. You're right, it doesn't change. I worked at the velvet spur. I survived things you can't imagine. I built myself up from nothing, with nothing but my own two hands and my refusal to break. That's who I am, and I'm not ashamed of it. Not anymore. She reached down with her free hand and pulled up her sleeve, showing the handkerchief tied around her wrist. I'm also Luke McCrae's wife. I'm the woman who saved this ranch. I'm the cook who turns away no one who's hungry, and I'm the person who's going to watch you ride away and never think about you again, because you don't matter, you never did. Dawson's face twisted with impotent rage. Then he mounted his horse and rode away without another word, and no one on Silver Ridge Ranch ever saw him again. The days that followed were strange and wonderful. The ranch hands threw together a celebration. Nothing fancy, just good food and better company. Everyone crowded into the cookhouse while Clem played a battered fiddle and Tommy sang off-key. Tessa wore her regular dress with a blue ribbon Luke had bought in town, and Luke wore his best shirt, and they danced in the firelight while the men cheered. The way station kept running. Word had spread about the woman who cooked miracles and the ranch that had fought off a thief, and travelers went out of their way to stop at Silver Ridge. Tessa hired 2 local girls to help with the cooking and serving, teaching them the same way her mother had taught her, with patience and high standards and the belief that honest work built character. One of those girls was young, barely 16, with haunted eyes and hands that shook when she thought no one was watching. Her name was Clara, and she'd come from a place Tessa recognized without asking. On Clara's 3rd day, Tessa gave her a tin marked Dreams and told her to save her wages there, told her that one day she'd have enough to choose her own path. Clara cried. Tessa held her and said, "You're going to be okay. I promise." 6 months later, on a crisp October afternoon, Tessa and Luke stood together in the yard and watched as the final beam went up on a new building, a proper cafe this time, built with profits from the way station and the cattle sales and the steady work of people who believed in what they were building. The sign over the door read Tessa's Table in letters Luke had carved himself. Inside, it smelled like cinnamon and smoke and second chances. There were tables and chairs, real ones, and a kitchen twice the size of the old cookhouse. There was a shelf lined with jars marked Dreams, one for each girl Tessa had hired and taught and helped save. And there was a small room in the back where Tessa and Luke lived, their belongings mixed together, their lives intertwined in ways that still surprised her sometimes. "You did it," Luke said, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "You built something real." "We did it," Tessa corrected, leaning back against him. "This is ours, all of it." They stood like that for a long time, watching the sun set over the mountains, the sky painted in shades of gold and red. Tessa thought about the girl she'd been, scared and alone and convinced she'd never be worth more than the worst things that had happened to her. And she thought about the woman she'd become, strong and loved and building something that mattered. Luke kissed the top of her head. "No regrets?" "Not a single one." Their wedding had been hasty, born from desperation and determination. But now, months later, with the ranch secured and their life together taking shape, Luke wanted to do it right. He told Tessa he wanted a real ceremony, something that felt permanent and chosen, not just whispered promises in the middle of the night. "We're already married," Tessa had said, laughing. "I know, but I want to marry you again. Want to stand in front of everyone and tell them what you mean to me, what we've built. Will you let me?" How could she say no to that? So on a Sunday in late October, under a crooked oak tree with leaves turned gold and amber, Luke and Tessa stood before a traveling preacher and said their vows again. This time, there were witnesses. All the ranch hands, dressed in their cleanest clothes, and Mr. McCrae with tears in his eyes, and the girls from Tessa's table holding wildflowers they'd picked that morning. Tessa wore a simple cream dress with a blue ribbon at the waist. Luke wore his best shirt and the look of a man who'd finally stopped running from his own life. Instead of exchanging rings, he retied the handkerchief around her wrist, the same one from that desperate night, the one that said, "Forgiven in red thread." But this time, he added another one to his own wrist, and when Tessa looked at it, she saw a word stitched in her careful hand because she'd made it for him in secret over the past weeks. Worthy. "You showed me I wasn't defined by my worst moments," she said softly. "Now I'm showing you the same. You're worthy, Luke, of love, of happiness, of the life we're building. Don't forget it." Luke's eyes filled, and he pulled her close and kissed her while the small crowd cheered. And for the first time in either of their lives, they felt truly, completely home. The celebration that followed was simple and perfect. Tessa had made a feast, roasted beef and vegetables from the garden she'd started, fresh bread and honey, apple pie that made even the gruffest cowboys sigh with contentment. There was music and laughter and dancing under the stars. And when night fell and the guests drifted away, Luke and Tessa walked hand in hand back to Tessa's table. Inside, the stove was still warm. On the counter, a fresh loaf of bread sat cooling, and beside it, a new tin marked Dreams with both their names on it. They'd filled it together over the months, saving for the future, planning for the children they might have, the life they were still building. Luke pulled Tessa close in the firelight. "Thank you." "For what?" "For walking into that cookhouse on the worst day of winter and refusing to leave. For fighting for this place like it mattered. For seeing me, really seeing me, and choosing me anyway." His voice caught. "For giving me a reason to stop running." Tessa reached up and cupped his face in her hands. "Thank you for being the kind of man who shows up. For standing beside me when no one else would. For looking at me and seeing strength instead of shame." She smiled. "For loving me loud enough that I finally believed I was worth loving." They stood like that in their cafe, in their life, in the future they'd fought so hard to claim. The girl from the velvet spur and the silent cowboy, the woman who'd survived everything, and the man who'd learned to stop surviving and start living. They'd ridden through fire and gossip and debt and desperation, and they'd come out the other side together. Their story didn't need a sequel. It didn't need more drama or more pain or more tests to prove what they'd already proven. It just needed this. Two people who'd chosen each other, again and again, in ways both grand and quiet, building a life one meal at a time, one kindness at a time, one day at a time. Tessa's table stood along the old cattle trail, a beacon for travelers and a home for those who needed one. Inside, it smelled of hope and hard work and the kind of love that transforms everything it touches. And every day, Tessa woke up beside the man who'd seen her at her worst and loved her at her best. And she knew she'd finally found the thing she'd been searching for her whole life. Not rescue, not redemption, just belonging, just home, just the quiet, steady knowledge that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Years later, when people asked how Tessa's table came to be, she'd smile and say it was built from smoke and shame and stubborn hope. Built by a woman who refused to let the world decide who she was, and a man who learned that showing up was the bravest thing he'd ever do. Built on the belief that second chances aren't given. They're earned, one choice at a time, one moment of courage at a time. And when the travelers sat down to eat, when they tasted the love and care baked into every biscuit and stirred into every pot of stew, they understood. Tessa's table wasn't just a cafe. It was proof that you could rise from the ashes, proof that love could bloom in the coldest winter, proof that the people who'd been broken and discarded and told they'd never amount to anything could build something fire couldn't touch. Luke and Tessa McCrae had ridden as far as they needed to go, straight into a life they'd chosen, fought for, and earned. Together. And that was enough. That was everything. That was home.